a Midnight Waffles podcast.
This is BattleStations, a podcast about the Columbus Destroyers and the Arena Football League. I'm Frank Walker. Thanks for joining us here for episode 1. BattleStations is brought to you in conjunction here with AFLFanzone.com. Cool website, definitely to check out. Their Twitter accounts at AFLFanzone. Just a cool news information site about the league. Fun place to try and meet up with other fans, get some discussion going on what's going on with the Arena Football League. Again, this is episode 1. There is an episode 0 if you've subscribed to us or if you're looking down the page. That is what I call the prologue, just kind of my own personal history with Arena Football. Not a whole lot of talk about the league itself in the modern times. Or I call it modern times, not like it was 1,000 years ago or anything, but just some of my own personal recollections on some things. But this is the first week where we're going to be talking at least somewhat football. Things are kind of tricky right now. If you are new to the Arena Football League, the Arena Football League has gone through a bit of a renaissance, a rebirth, if you will. And one of the side effects of that is they've had a kind of a funny collective bargaining agreement with the players. Part of it was after last season, every player became a free agent. And none of them have actually signed with teams yet. So, as of now, any discussion we have about the league isn't really going to be focusing on players as much, since we have no idea who's going to be on the Columbus team. And more in the league in general, and kind of what's being built in Columbus. Now, you do notice from the intro, I'm already calling the team the Destroyers. I'm doing that with a certain amount of trepidation, knowing that at any given moment they may announce the team name as something different. If they do that, I believe it's a huge mistake. You've already got so much built-in goodwill with that name. You've already got so much brand recognition with that name. I think it would be very silly of the Arena Football League and a missed opportunity to just try and to give up that brand recognition and that goodwill just to try and name it something new, especially since all signs, considering that ColumbusDestroyers.com is a registered website now, and you've already got, if you go there's not really much of anything, but the AFL still holds the name, the copyright on the trademark on the name, Columbus Destroyers, so there's no reason not to do it. But that's my own personal feelings on it. If they change it, I mean, I'm still going to be a fan of the team, obviously, but I just don't see a reason not to do it at this point. So, again, for those of you who are new to the Arena Football League, coming back to it, which is what I'm assuming a good chunk of this fan base is going to be for the Destroyers, people who loved the team when they were here, and then it was gone. And it just seemed to be kind of... If you didn't follow the league real closely, it seemed kind of weird. It seemed out of the blue that it was just gone. And so the first thing I wanted to discuss tonight was kind of bringing you up to speed on where the AFL is. Now, back when the Destroyers' run ended, the AFL was in a very different place. There was a period of time, it was right when there was this deal they had with where they were on national television, the league was anyway, and they were trying to do Monday night games on ESPN, and the league was up to one of its highest numbers ever as far as teams, up to 19, and there was this idea that the AFL was about to kind of break through and become the 5th major sport in America after football, basketball, baseball, and hockey. And as of now, I think when we're talking revenue and interest, we're probably getting pretty close to MLS being there. I remember back at the time, the idea was that the big competitor for that 5th big sport in America was NASCAR. And that's always kind of been a rotating thing for sports leagues, to try and be the 5th major sport. And there was really this sense in the Arena League that they were going to get there. Well, after 2008, the league actually went on hiatus. And for many people, they thought, well, that's the end of the Arena Football League. It will not come back, because it is a kind of almost a running joke in indoor football circles, which if you're not familiar, there's 7, 8, 9 leagues around the country that are in any different state of running that do indoor football in any manner of arenas with any level of quality players, and it's all over the place. And when a team goes on hiatus, it's relatively commonly believed that's it. The team's done. They're just saying they're going on hiatus with this idea that, oh no, we'll be back, and it never really happens. Well, what happened when the AFL went south is that the owners just didn't have the money to meet what needed to be done. They'd kind of overspent what they were trying to do. I remember at one point they were saying the salary cap was up to, over $1 million, and they were paying the players a lot. And they were, teams were having to take flights everywhere. And it just, if you've ever studied the economics of what I would call the Arena Football League a minor league sport. If you've ever studied the economics of it, it gets expensive real fast to try and have a sport, a league, especially a national size league. It's the reason most minor league baseball teams tend to play in very regional areas, because things like travel and hotels and stuff get expensive real quick. And the league just wasn't ready for it. And so when they went on hiatus, and that was it. Now when they came back with fewer teams. And the reason the Destroyers didn't come back is that when the Destroyers were around, the names you hear as far as ownership were Jim Renacci, who at different points has run for office in Ohio and is just a very fabulously wealthy man who lives in Ohio. And Joey Galloway were the names that really were tied to it. But there was a third of the ownership that was done by the Blue Jackets. John H. McConnell, the owner of the Blue Jackets, owned a third of the team. And what's underestimated in the history of the franchise is how much this helped the Destroyers. And part of it is that with the Destroyers, the fact that a third of the team was owned by the Blue Jackets, the team was kind of co-operated by the Blue Jackets. And it was a really good concept for them at the time because they had access to things like the season ticket holder list. They had access to sales leads the Blue Jackets had leads to, the sponsorship deals, the fact that you already had the people who controlled the arena. So it was a partnership as opposed to having to be the little brother in that arena. And there was a lot that things like when they were selling a sponsorship for the Blue Jackets, they could make it a little add-on or a sweetener to add the Destroyers. It was something where the value was both could help each other out a decent amount. And so the Destroyers in and of themselves were a decent thing as far as a business proposition. But the problem was, when you're talking about somebody like John H. McConnell, who owned an NHL franchise, who built Worthington Industries, and his family, and JMac Incorporated, who run the Blue Jackets, when the league suspended, my understanding of the situation, and I'm not a reporter, I may have spoken with some people along the way who happened to work in those offices, was that they were just kind of done with it. They didn't like the idea of being associated with, and I use this term knowing its derivativeness, a Mickey Mouse organization like the Arena Football League. Because especially at that time, when a league goes on hiatus, can you imagine how crazy it would be if tomorrow the NHL or Major League Baseball, or any other major American sport, if MLS said, oh, we're going to go on hiatus for a year. That's the death knell for the league. All of a sudden, you are now a minor league. No one's paying serious attention to you anymore. And I think that's what happened that first time around, because the people with real money said, I don't want to be a part of it. I don't want to be a part of what's going on if this is what I have to deal with. People who cannot hold up their end of the deal. I really think that's what happened. And this time is very different. If you rummage around on the Reddits and the message boards and whatnot of arena football fandom, something you'll see is there's a very different feeling towards ownership now of the Arena Football League than it was back then. Back then, arena football was still very much, there was the idea that all the ownership groups, it was either just getting a rich guy interested to get a new team, or, oh, hey, let's get some random celebrity to get a team. Because I remember the big deal was that, oh, we got John Bon Jovi to buy into the Philadelphia Soul, and we've got the band Kiss to buy the LA Kiss. That's still just the silliest name I've ever heard of in the history of sports. But the idea was you would try and get these celebrity owners, whereas the closest one that might have been a good celebrity / regular owner was in Dallas. You had Jerry Jones owning the Desperados at the time. But there was this sense of, let's just get rich guys, let's just fill this up. But then a lot of the other teams, like there was a team like the Nashville Cats, and these teams just couldn't keep up with the commitments they had made. Well, this time around, the Columbus team, I'm still calling them the Destroyers, are actually league owned. And the other new team in Atlantic City, which there was a voting contest for the name. It sounds like they're going to go with Royals, which I think is a mistake, because that's the Kansas City Royals. If you're going to do something, make your own thing. The one I really liked was Blackjacks. I liked that a lot. But these were league-owned teams. Now you say to yourself, who owns the league? Well, the league has 2 ownership groups over the 4 teams that existed last year. There's one called Trifecta Sports and Entertainment. That is the league. That is the one that has owned and run the Philadelphia franchise, the Philadelphia Soul, and the Albany Empire. And it's the name it's the team where the org group, or Ron Jaworski, who most people know from the time he was on ESPN, but has gone more into an entrepreneurial end after being an analyst. He's the face of that. And it's a group with money who's owned the Soul for a long time. And honestly, I think Ron Jaworski is the one who's probably, and the group that owned the Soul are the group who has dragged the Arena Football League from when they took that year hiatus to where they are now. The only other group, because last year the league only ran with 4 teams, is the group that owns the team in Baltimore and the team in Washington. And that is Monumental Sports and Entertainment, which is owned by Ted Leonsis, who is also Monumental Sports and Entertainment. If you're a hockey fan and you know the name Ted Leonsis, he also owns the Washington Capitals, and then owns the Washington Wizards of the NBA and the Washington Mystics of the WNBA. And I think these 2 groups have a very different plan. And it was compared by the commissioner on a episode of the State of the Empire podcast, which is the Albany Empire's kind of official show. It was described how MLS was originally built to run, and still kind of does in many ways, which is that the idea with MLS, although they've kind of gotten away from this, but the original plan on MLS was it was owned by a central entity. And thus you could pick what cities you thought were a best fit as far as a market for the league and where you thought the league could make money, as opposed to, hey, let's find somebody rich who wants to put a team in their town. And the reason this is good is, instead of just this being some rich person's vanity project, you're putting teams in cities that are good for the league. And I always thought that Columbus was a great city for arena football. Their attendance was always good. The fans supported it. It was never the most important thing in the world, but it's arena football, and it got a decent amount of respect for what it was in a pretty good sized city like Columbus. And Columbus is a city that, come summer, which the Arena Football League first games are late April, college basketball's over. The Blue Jackets, if the Blue Jackets are in the playoffs, they still got something going. But the baseball team is the Clippers, who are also a minor league thing. So you're not going up against a major sport again. Again, unless the Blue Jackets are making a long playoff run, which, man, I hope that would happen. But, at this point so far, it looks like the safe bet is to bet against that. Sadly. I also host a podcast about the Blue Jackets called the Shoot Once Podcast, if you want to give that a listen and hear my sadness and whatever with that sometimes. Anyway. It's a good city built for it. And I think the other city they're adding, Atlantic City, is a good city because there's no major sports in Atlantic City. It's part of the reason Albany was such a home run for them. There's just no major sports. And there's certain areas and cities that are a better fit for what the Arena Football League wants to do. And before we get into our few items we have about the actual Columbus Arena Football League team, the one other thing I wanted to hit this week, there was a article that came up, which I'm having a hard time getting anything to load right now, apparently, in the Sports Business Daily. It was out of Business Journal out of New Albany, where their owner actually had, I guess, a short interview with their folks up there, and the big quote that came out of it that everybody's talking about right now in the arena football world is that he said he believes the league could grow from its current 6 teams to 20 or 25 across the country in the coming years. Now, as being number 6, there is something specific I want to say about this. I want them... I don't think it's a bad idea to kind of have a big view of where this league is going to go. But I think it is vitally important to go slow and to pick the cities the right way. Now, there's already talk in the league. I mean, obviously, that you can't just rely on 2 ownership groups forever. I mean, obviously, there are league-owned teams, but the league is made up of 2 ownership groups who essentially own the league-owned teams. So you're going to have to bring in outside people eventually. And I think part of where Columbus is a good choice is there are people talking about how maybe Dan Gilbert might take over it since he does own the suspended team. We talked about what that means up in Cleveland, the Cleveland Gladiators. But with a guy like Ted Leonsis involved, a guy who owns an NHL franchise, a guy who owns an NBA franchise, a guy who's real money and can inspire some type of confidence, it is very possible that he may be able to convince John P. McConnell, the current owner of the Blue Jackets, that this may be a business worth getting back into. Or even if not him, he may be able to convince real legitimate investors, and because it's somebody like Leonsis who works with major league teams, they can do the proper background vetting on whoever it is they sell a franchise to. So whoever may take over the Destroyers at some point can be vetted properly. And when I say they should go slow on this, what I'm thinking is the original 4 teams in the league were relatively short drive from each other. Yet Albany, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, all very east. Albany was a little bit of a drive, but even if you fly or whatnot, not too big of a deal. Now they've added Atlantic City. You've got 5 teams right along that kind of east coast, and then a few hours west you get to Columbus. If I were in the strategy group for the league, my goal would be growing this thing a region at a time before you start trying to push nationally. I think the worst idea, although it'd be great to see certain franchises come back, I think the worst idea would be to say, okay, next year we're bringing back the San Jose SaberCats and going all the way out west. I think that would be a poor choice. I think you can see a number like 20 or 25 being hit. But when I say regionally, again, we've talked earlier in the show, I talked just a bit about how when you're talking about minor league sports, things like travel are a big deal. They're a massive expense for a team. Well, you've got that corridor of 5 teams on the East Coast. If I were the AFL, now that I've put Columbus here, I would start saying, okay, let's start doing a little Midwest grouping of maybe 5 teams, 4 to 5 teams. And there's cities where it could work. The Cleveland Gladiators were a pretty good draw in their time. They did well. For the few years they were in the league, they did very well. From what I understand as far as attendance, and they were decently successful in the field, but they did pretty well. They made an Arena Bowl appearance. They were a pretty good team. So, and the fans still to an extent clamor for them. And I did joke about the whole idea of once a team's suspended, does that mean they're coming back? But there are apparently little things the Cleveland Gladiators have kept around. They've never been officially eliminated from any of Dan Gilbert's stuff on the website about the queue between the Monsters and the Cavaliers. And they've occasionally made little appearances where they've done little football camps and things like that. So they're not gone. And something like having the Columbus Destroyers back might be an enticement. So if you had Cleveland, Columbus, the other 2 cities that I think are just ripe for arena football are really in this area as well. You're looking at Indianapolis, and I would say Louisville. When I'm talking about those cities, I'm talking about cities where I see that same mold in the same way that you kind of have with Atlantic City and Albany, where once you get past, in Indianapolis, once you get past college basketball season, and whatever run the Pacers are making, and even if the Pacers are making a run in the NBA playoffs, that's a big enough town where two sports can compete. So you put a team in Indianapolis and Louisville, again, after college basketball season, which ends, the second week of April? So it's over before the first week of the AFL season. There's not really much in the way of major sports, but there's a great arena down there. And a lot of people in the Louisville area who would, I believe, go to games, to support an Arena Football League team. Those four teams alone would give you that Columbus, Indianapolis, Cleveland, Louisville corridor. And then there's a handful of teams you might be able to throw in there as well. A handful of cities. You could do Pittsburgh. You could potentially do Cleveland. Maybe Chicago would be in that. Chicago seems to be the city that the Arena Football League is always trying to get a team in. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. We'd see. But you'd have those. I think you would have options then. And if those other teams are successful, it gives you some options. And then later, maybe you may have a southern region, or maybe you have a Texas region, like a Midwest, or not Texas Midwest, but kind of that Texas Southwest region. The farther west you get, the harder things start getting because travel becomes more difficult. But there is a long play here I think you could do. And with things like a 12-game season, that makes it easy. Because if you could have 4 or 5 hubs around the country, where each one of them has 4 or 5 teams, specifically you did like 5 teams, you play every team in your division twice, so that's 80 your games. Then you just have to go 4 on the road that are farther trips. And if you kind of help those teams try and match that up a little more geographically, you can help the overall financial health of the league. Now, I know some of you aren't big fans of hearing about the business side of sport, talking about sports, but when you do this with something like the Arena Football League, it's important because you're trying to keep the league viable for as long as possible, and try and make it where it's a healthy thing where it can grow. Because I think part of the long-term health of the Arena Football League, and this is actually kind of in their mission anymore, they're talking about is 2 things. You want to make viable things where they can have local fan bases that feed into it, that can make things break even, maybe even make a little bit of money at some point. And they are also pushing heavily into being gambled on, which for some of you is a new concept, the idea that a sports league is pushing it. But the league's official Twitter hashtag is actually #BetOnUs. So it's a little bit of a different thing there. One other thing I did leave out in the discussion that happened with Albany's owner is he put in an interesting little tidbit, which was I'm just going to read from the piece here. Even so, the Empire was not profitable, which Nolan said is expected for the first few years of any team. Costs to start the team in the AFL were about $1.5 million. We didn't expect in year 1 that anyone was going to make any money, Nolan said. What you really hope for in a league like this is that after a couple of years you can break even. And if you have the kind of attendance that we have, I think eventually you can probably be profitable. That is the right mindset to have when you get into sports. There is a fun saying that I've heard. I want to say Jeff Merrick off of Canadian media said it, which is, do you know the fastest way to become a millionaire? Be a billionaire and buy a sports team. And the joke is that you're going to lose money year to year on sports. And there's a certain reality to that. A lot of sports franchises don't necessarily make a lot of money. Some of them are profitable, definitely, but a lot of them aren't. But you're making money through things like growing the value of the franchise, through the other side things, like with Monumental Sports and Entertainment. Part of what Ted Leonsis is doing there is he is using the 2 teams he has to add value to things like the streaming apps he has, which also has special content when it comes to the Capitals and the Wizards and that kind of stuff. And it just grows overall a brand and a way to make money there. So that's my piece this week on the business side of it. There's a couple things I wanted to get into as far as the actual team itself, which is fun and exciting because we can actually talk about a few things. One is that the people we know who are actually going to touch the football side. There's some other business people, but hey, we've talked enough business. The head of football operations for the Columbus AFL team is Dominic Jones. Somebody who, if you don't follow arena football, you probably don't know a whole lot about. Dominic Jones is a guy who had a relatively short career as a player in the Arena Football League. Started played college football at Otterbein. Played some for the University of Minnesota. He went to Minnesota first, then went to Otterbein, and then his whole professional career has been in the Arena Football League. Played for the Cleveland Gladiators, then spent a year with the Predators down in Orlando, then went back to the Gladiators for a couple years, then went into coaching. He was the defensive backs coach in 2016. Then in 2017, he became the assistant head coach / director of football operations. So this is the guy right now who's trying to orchestrate doing team tryouts, who's trying to watch some film on Arena League players. As we discussed, everybody from last year is a free agent, so he's the one looking at free agents and trying to decide who to make a run for the Destroyers and different things like that. And what makes it a little different in the Arena Football League, to my understanding, these guys don't make, these guys are going to make $1 million off this. They will make what would, for a summer's work, depending on how long they're actually going to be working, would be a decent wage over, 4 or 5 months of work, to my understanding. I believe that the pay range is around a couple thousand a game, so this is who he's looking for. So it's not like, and a lot of these guys, too, are guys who are still chasing the dream, wanting to be in the NFL, but some guys just want to keep playing and are comfortable, spending some time doing it in the Arena League. So it's a different attitude. It's not like we can go watch college film and start picking out the guys, because this is a level of football where if a guy's got a good job offer on the table, he might take that over playing in the AFL, and that's just kind of what it is there. So that's going to be our head of football operations. So he's looking into things and seeing what can be done. He did say that on a interview on the Ninth Man Nation podcast where they had him on, he did say they were talking about probably naming a coach the next week. Now, somebody might have beat him to the punch. For the Love of Sports, a radio show out of Albany, they were talking with the head coach of the Albany Empire and asking him, were there certain games on the calendar he was circling and whatnot. And he talks about how, well, I'm just ready for the next game. And I'm, so then there, and Columbus's first game is going to Albany. And he says, I'm looking to Columbus, and I'm sure, and the name he used was Cedric Walker, is putting together a good staff there. So I think we got a little bit of an early sneak peek into who our head coach is going to be. And Cedric Walker, for those of you who don't know, is a guy who has spent more than 20 years around arena football. He has jumped around all sorts of teams: the Predators, the Arizona Rattlers, the Chicago Rush, the Austin Wranglers. He played for the Las Vegas Gladiators, the last team he played for in arena football. After that, he's coached between arena and indoor football over 10 years. Teams like the Bakersfield Blitz and the Green Blade Blizzard and all that. His most recent work has been as a defensive coordinator for the Baltimore Brigade. So this is a guy who's been around the game in arena football, who is looking into, he's the one who's probably going to be a big part of who's on that, looking into who they're going to be signing, who they're going to be looking at tryouts, all that sort of stuff. So I'm excited to see where things start actually going. I'm super excited to start hearing when we have tryouts, to start seeing if there's any other information they're going to provide, anything like that. Now, this show, as just kind of an addendum here at the end, the plan is once the season starts formally, it will be a weekly show. I can't promise how often the show is going to happen since that. Because with the Arena Football League, this isn't like my hockey podcast or like the major sports in America where there's news at least trickling out all year long. The Arena Football League, when it goes into the off season, a lot of times there's just not a ton of news. So I can't guarantee when shows will happen. I'll try to keep them pretty regular until we hit the season. And then from there, we'll kind of, after this season, we'll kind of play it by ear, see how things go. But I do want to thank you all for listening to the show today. If you do want to give me a follow on Twitter, the Twitter account is @BStationPod. That's where I'm going to be doing most of the interaction as far as the show goes. But do want to thank you all for listening. And I just can't wait to get to the start of the season. Thank you for listening to Battle Stations.